Hey friends, it's Just the Gems, I'm Brandon. You might have noticed, if you've been around for any length of time, that I talk a lot about JRPGs on this channel. They occupy a pretty significant percentage of my brain activity at any point of the day or night. Who knows what sorts of scientific breakthroughs I might have been responsible for if I hadn't spent every waking hour completely absorbed by Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger. But that's neither here nor there. The JRPG genre has changed a lot over the decades, and I wanted to take a look at some of the games that made those changes happen. I'm not just talking about games that had unique ideas. I mean games that took their unique ideas, slammed them down on the table, and said, all right, this is what we're doing now. If future games decided to follow suit, then I'd say that particular game had a pretty big impact on the genre. What I have here are 5 games that I think brought about some significant changes to JRPGs as a whole. I know there are definitely more than this, so I'd love to hear your suggestions down in the comments for other games to look at. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that any of these games were necessarily the first game to do this particular thing that they did. I'm just saying that I see these particular games as the sort of pivot point at which the genre shifted, and this particular element started to be used in a lot of other games. Anyway, let's dive in. I've never really hid the fact that I'm not the biggest fan of Final Fantasy III on the Famicom. I'm not going to try and argue it's a bad game, because it's not. But the direction it nudged the series in is not one I'm super fond of. But just because I'm not fond of it doesn't mean that it wasn't revolutionary or that it didn't bring about big changes for the genre. The big change we're talking about here is, of course, the job system. Dragon Quest III was released in Japan a year or so before Final Fantasy III, and technically speaking, it had a class change system as well. In Dragon Quest III, once a party member reached level 20, you could take them to a special shrine and change their class. This came with some pretty big caveats though. First, your character's level would be reset to 1. Second, your current attributes would be cut in half. And third, your hero character isn't able to change classes at all. Still, for its time, it allowed for a surprising amount of customizability. Final Fantasy III looked at the foundation Dragon Quest III laid with its class-changing mechanic and decided to do it one better. Now you could change classes, or jobs, as Final Fantasy decided to call them, completely at will. No more resetting your level or having to achieve a particular milestone in order to make it happen. And while your abilities did change when you took on a new job, they changed in relation to the type of job you took on. Changing from a warrior to a white mage, your MP is going up and your strength is going down. Decide white mage isn't working and want to try out thief? Say goodbye to all that MP, but say hello to a ton of agility. And all of these jobs were available to all your characters all the time. While there is a sort of complicated job level system that temporarily affects your stats negatively when you change jobs, it's not too big of a deal, and within a handful of battles, everyone will find themselves in top fighting form. Of course, the game doesn't start by dropping 23 complicated jobs into your lap. It doles them out over time in a sort of sensible way that future games would replicate. Yeah, this was the start of the job system, but it would continue on in so many more games. Final Fantasy V, of course, which picked up the torch and expanded on the system by allowing you to master certain job skills to use with other unrelated jobs. And Final Fantasy Tactics would famously bring the job system into the tactical JRPG world. Other games have dabbled in it, like Final Fantasy XII: The Zodiac Age, and even more modern series like Octopath Traveler and Bravely Default have chosen the job system as one of their defining characteristics. Other games with class systems tend to model themselves after Final Fantasy III's more free and loose take on the class system. Final Fantasy III is one of the more timid Final Fantasies. It doesn't get talked about all that much, it gets easily overshadowed by its younger siblings, and doofuses like me on the internet aren't the biggest fans of it. But even I can't deny the impact this little game has had on JRPGs. Final Fantasy IV did an enormous amount of work in bringing JRPGs into the 16-bit era. Graphically, of course, it was a huge step forward with its Mode 7 overworld and its big, colorful battle sprites. Musically, well, the SNES sound chip used real instruments, albeit sampled down to teensy tiny file sizes, but the upgrade in tech basically unleashed the full potential of Nobuo Uematsu. And the story was a full-on science fiction fantasy melodrama with an enormous cast of characters and more twists than a Twizzler factory. It was no slouch on the gameplay front either. Now, for the first time, you could have up to 5 party members at one time, which is almost unthinkable today. Gone is the job system from its predecessor, but in its place are characters that fill many of those same roles with their various specialties, like Kain the Dragoon or Rosa the White Mage. And saying goodbye to the Final Fantasy series in the 4th entry at long last is the traditional turn-based combat. Yes, active time battles were in, and stodgy turn-based battles were out. Now, time moved ever forward, whether you were ready for it or not. In Final Fantasy IV, turn order is once again determined by your character's speed, but now you no longer had to input every command at the start of a turn. Instead, when your character was ready to act, you could input their command right then. This allowed for you to make on-the-fly adjustments to your strategy that just wouldn't have been possible in a straight-up turn-based game. For example, in an older Final Fantasy, I might have had all my characters attack. Then, as I'm watching the action unfold, an enemy blasts my Black Mage, dropping him down to near death. But my poor White Mage, somehow oblivious to all this, just swings their staff, leaving the poor guy to his horrible fate. But in Final Fantasy IV, if Rydia takes a big hit, I can have Rosa swoop in with a healing spell straight away when her turn comes up. The active time battle system stuck around in a basically unchanged form for an unprecedented 6 Final Fantasy games in a row. And its influence on future JRPGs is still felt to this day. Now, even when a game is turn-based, you're much more likely to see something akin to Final Fantasy X or the Trails series with a turn order visible on screen. Very rarely will you find yourself inputting all actions for all characters at the start of each turn. And this isn't the last major JRPG trend that Square would set in the 90s. There are a lot of things that I wish JRPGs would have stolen from Chrono Trigger. For one, I'd love to see even more time travel based games. If they're done well, they can be some of the most engaging plots. See Radiant Historia for further evidence of that. For another thing, the way Chrono Trigger handles its battles right there on the screen. No separate battle arena, just perfectly curated battles from beginning to end. That just never really caught on. Likely not because it was unpopular, but just because it was so difficult for the developers to implement. No, the one major trend that Chrono Trigger encouraged was limiting active party size to 3 characters. Now, I'm not saying Chrono Trigger was the first JRPG to feature a 3-character party, not at all. The earliest one I can think of is Dragon Quest II for the NES. But after Dragon Quest II, we saw developers experiment with party sizes quite a bit, from 4 in future Dragon Quest games and other series like Lufia, to even 5 in Final Fantasy IV. But Chrono Trigger established 3 characters as the sort of de facto AAA standard for battle party sizes. In some ways, I'm guessing this is due to the way the game itself is set up. For one thing, all your active party members follow you around on the map in this game, unlike many JRPGs at the time, so a party larger than 3 could get a bit unwieldy. The same goes for the battles themselves, since they take place right there in the game world, and space is at a premium. Why so many future games leaned toward 3-character parties despite not having those same limitations though? I couldn't say. Of course, there are definitely exceptions to this trend, such as the Suikoden games giving you 6 character slots to work with, and of course Dragon Quest stubbornly sticking with 4-character parties after they established that limit in Dragon Quest III. But 3 characters definitely feels like the typical JRPG party size these days, and I think that's in large part due to the success of Chrono Trigger, showing that you could still create fun and strategic battles with a limited team. A lot of people think of Harvest Moon when the topic of first ever farming RPGs comes up, and they're not wrong. Harvest Moon was definitely the first, or at least the first incredibly popular, JRPG to feature farming as its main gameplay element. But Harvest Moon lacks combat in any meaningful sense. Your actions all revolve around farm life, and while that can be a very compelling gameplay loop, it doesn't scratch the same itch that a turn-based or action RPG does. No, if you want to find the granddaddy of real farming JRPGs, you need to look at Rune Factory, the fantasy Harvest Moon spin-off series that started in 2006 and is still going strong to this day. This lifted the addictive farming gameplay loop from its predecessor and served it up with a healthy helping of real, actual combat. Turns out, as much as people loved farming games, they also seem to love a nice mix of farming and battling. There must be something to it. You have to admit it, even if you don't personally care for it, because it's not every day an entire genre is born, and it's not every game that's capable of making that happen. I think part of the appeal is the routine of it all. Not everyone will be drawn to a game that asks you to do chores, but in a very real way, games with this sort of routine built into them become popular because it feeds a very human need we have to order and structure the elements of our lives. Now, that doesn't always sound the most appealing to me, but that could be in part because my life is one giant chaos machine churning out disorder on the regular. But a bit of routine in my games isn't a turn-off by any means. We wouldn't have games like Stardew Valley or Sakuna of Rice and Ruin without Rune Factory. And I'll just be real with you. If it weren't for Rune Factory, I wouldn't have one of my favorite games of all time, Harvestella. So on a personal level, I'm incredibly thankful that this series found its way into being, chores and all. With Persona 3 Reloaded coming out in just a precious few months from the release of this video, I'm getting newly hyped for some dark and brooding Persona action. Persona 3 definitely doesn't have the bright and cheerful aesthetic of Persona 4, or the jazzy cool aesthetic of Persona 5, though the remake is giving it a healthy dose of Persona cool for sure. Now, it's a much darker game than its successors, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. Persona 3 wasn't my first Persona game, that was 4. But playing 3 really helped me to appreciate one of the now defining features of the Persona series, social links. The idea of spending time with your party members outside of battle and getting to see real gameplay benefits from it is a great one. And while other games had definitely dabbled in this, like Thousand Arms on the PS1 for example, it was Persona 3 that made this feature a genre staple, both for better and for worse. From games that feature full-on social link style setups like the Trails of Cold Steel series, to games that merely borrow some ideas about strengthening bonds between characters, like the Mary Skelter games, the influence of Persona 3 can be felt pretty broadly across the JRPG genre these days. In some cases, like the aforementioned Trails of Cold Steel series, it can feel to some people, like me, that social links end up taking the place of meaningful character relationships developing in an organic way that's felt throughout the story. But other games focus more on the gameplay rewards you experience for participating in social activities. And still other games use the social link aspect so well, like Blue Reflection Second Light, that not only are you gaining gameplay benefits from participating in them, but you're learning so much more about the characters themselves in a way that purely enhances your enjoyment of the story. The ripple effect of Persona 3's dabbling in social links continues to be felt, and I'm sure the Persona series itself will continue to iterate and improve on what they've created. So, that's my list. What do you think? I might be interested in exploring this topic further, so if you have any thoughts about games that changed or impacted the genre of JRPGs in a significant way, and you don't mind me stealing them, drop me a comment. Thank you all so much for watching, liking, subscribing. It means a ton to me. Anyway, until next time. Bye.